It started with a folded napkin, not words, not yet, but the way it was left behind, carefully placed beside a chipped mug of untouched tea at table 4, like whoever left it had thought about the space it would take up in the world, and Riley didn't touch it at first, didn't even look at it longer than necessary. Just swept it into the trash bin along with the rest of the late-night mess at the diner where she'd worked the night shift for the past 11 months, the same shift where time crawled like an old dog, where coffee burned into the carafe because no one came in after 2, and where Riley had learned the difference between silence and loneliness. One could be endured, the other hollowed her out slowly, but that night, and the 5 after, the napkin returned, always folded, always left at the end of the same booth, same time, no name, no one staying long enough for conversation, just a pair of quiet eyes behind glasses. A faint nod, tea untouched, and gone before she even brought the check, and the napkin, always there, neat and waiting, like a whisper pressed between linen, but still, she never opened it, not out of disinterest but fear, because Riley had built her world so carefully, brick by brick of routine, of not wanting more, of not hoping again, and anything as small and strange as a note from a stranger threatened to push a crack through all of it. Her coworkers didn't notice, not really, because the night shift was only hers, her hours alone, her silence uninterrupted by gossip or distraction, just flickering fluorescence, the hum of the fridge motor, and an old radio that only caught static until someone nudged it twice and prayed for jazz. But she knew, she felt it, every time that man walked in, gray coat, eyes that scanned the room like he already knew what was broken, and hands that didn't fidget, like he had nothing left to be nervous about. She felt watched, not in a way that curled her spine with discomfort, but in a way that made her feel like maybe her tiredness was finally visible, like maybe someone saw past the uniform, the badge that said Riley in peeling letters, the too wide smile she wore for customers who tipped in crumpled singles and half-eaten compliments. She wanted to read them, the notes, God she did, but she couldn't, not yet, because what if it was nothing, or worse, what if it was something kind, something honest, something that made her believe that someone still cared enough to write it down, and then what? Would she start hoping again? Would she wait for him? Would she start dressing up before her shift, curling her hair, changing her perfume? Would she start looking for a future again in a place where she'd only ever learned how to survive? She didn't want that, didn't trust it, not since Dylan left with her savings and a suitcase full of promises, not since her mom disappeared into a halfway house and didn't call for 6 months, not since the miscarriage, which no one even knew about. Because Riley never told anyone she was pregnant, especially not the man who was too busy chasing get-rich schemes to notice she was bleeding alone in a bathroom stall. No, Riley didn't open notes. She kept her hands busy, cleaning the same counter twice, refilling coffee for truck drivers who forgot her name each time, checking the clock like it owed her answers. But on the 7th night, something shifted. The man came in later than usual, looking tired in a way she recognized, the kind of tired that lives in your bones, and for the first time, he spoke, just one sentence, as she refilled his tea without asking, "You look like you haven't been seen in a long time," and she didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't look at him, just walked back to the counter and pretended her hands weren't shaking, and after he left, after the bell above the door jingled like always, she walked over to table 4 and stared at the napkin for a long time before picking it up, unfolding it with the care of someone unwrapping an old letter from a ghost, and inside, written in neat, dark ink, "I see how hard you try," 6 words, just 6, and something broke in her, not loudly, not with sobs or drama, just a quiet breath she didn't realize she'd been holding for years, slipping out of her like a secret, and she folded the napkin again, this time neatly, and tucked it into her apron, and when her shift ended, when the sun started bleeding into the sky and the bus screeched up to take her home, she didn't fall asleep on the ride like usual, didn't zone out staring at the blurred trees and street lamps. She just held that folded napkin in her hand the whole way home, and let herself feel seen for the first time in a very, very long time. She didn't tell anyone about the note, not her neighbor across the hall who sometimes brought her leftover stew, not her shift manager who only cared if she clocked in on time, not even herself, not really, because saying it aloud would make it real. And Riley had spent the better part of the last 3 years learning how to bury real things beneath layers of necessary silence. But that night after reading it, After feeling those 6 simple words echo through every tired inch of her, she couldn't stop thinking about what kind of man notices someone's exhaustion and writes it down like a prayer, because no one ever did that, not for her. People took from her, leaned on her, needed her, disappeared on her, but this was different, and when she stepped into her next shift the following night, something inside her shifted too, just a little, just enough that her shoulders felt less tight, her steps less weighed down, but her heartbeat picked up every time the bell above the diner door rang. And when it finally did at 10:14 p.m., like always, she didn't look up right away, didn't want to seem eager, but she knew it was him, felt the quiet way he moved, the space he took up without trying, and when she finally glanced over, he was already seated at table 4, gray coat folded beside him, eyes on the window instead of her, like he was giving her the space to come to him or not. And that was maybe the first kindness of all, no expectation, no assumption, just stillness. She walked over, hands steady this time, tea already poured, and placed it in front of him without a word. He looked up then, just a moment, and nodded once, the kind of nod that carried gratitude without noise, and for the next hour, they didn't speak, not once, but it wasn't awkward, it was familiar, and when he left, the napkin was there again, folded perfectly beside the saucer, and this time, she didn't wait until the shift ended, she walked straight to the back counter, away from the cameras, and opened it slowly, her fingers careful like they were touching something sacred, and inside, some people glow quietly. You're one of them, and it was ridiculous, how much that line hit her, how much it felt like a balm on wounds she didn't even realize were still open, how much it made her want to be that glow, for someone, for herself, and the worst part, or maybe the best, was that she still didn't even know his name. He never asked for hers either. Never tried to make small talk or flirt or invade, he just wrote and watched and left. And over the next week, she began to expect him, not out of fantasy, but comfort, like the sun coming up, like the streetlights flickering on at dusk, like proof that someone out there noticed her trying to hold her world together with nothing but fraying string and forced smiles. The notes kept coming, never dramatic, never love letters, just pieces of thought. You don't need to be perfect to matter. Or being tired doesn't mean you're weak, or you deserve a life that feels like breathing, and each time, she folded them gently and kept them in a worn envelope tucked into her locker, and every time life pressed too hard, when her paycheck came short, when her landlord raised the rent again, when her mother called crying from a borrowed phone, she reached for those notes like they were oxygen. But of course, life doesn't like to stay kind for too long, and just as she began to hope, to really hope, he didn't show. Not one night, not the next, not the one after. And something about that absence made everything ache sharper, because now there was a space, an empty booth, a quiet without comfort, and it made her realize how much she'd let him in, how much those tiny gestures had stitched something inside her back together, and now it was unraveling again with each night he stayed away. She didn't ask questions, didn't talk about it, just got quieter, worked harder, tried to convince herself it hadn't meant anything. That maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe she imagined how much it mattered, but one night, as she cleaned the booth, she found something different, not a note, but a small business card tucked under the salt shaker, embossed in silver, with only one line, Holden Carter, Property Management Group, and on the back, written in the same handwriting she now knew by heart, you don't need to open this door. But I hope you do, and that was when it hit her. He wasn't just some regular customer. He wasn't drifting through town, he owned the damn building, maybe more, maybe everything, and she didn't know what to feel. Betrayal, embarrassment, confusion, but mostly she felt scared, because this whole time she thought it was safe to believe in something small, in something simple and kind, and now it felt bigger, more complicated, layered with power and questions she wasn't sure how to answer. She folded the card, placed it in her apron, and that night she didn't sleep. Just sat on her apartment floor surrounded by his notes, reading them one by one until the sun came up, wondering how to protect her heart from something that had already quietly claimed it. The card stayed in her apron pocket for 3 days before she even touched it again, not because she didn't want to call him, but because she didn't know which version of him would answer. Was he Holden Carter, the man who saw her without asking for anything, who left quiet encouragements like footprints across her tired life, or was he Holden Carter, the landlord, the property group owner, The man who could rewrite her world with one decision, and maybe had already done so without telling her. And it was that not knowing that kept her frozen, stuck somewhere between gratitude and fear, because the only thing scarier than being invisible was being seen by someone powerful enough to rewrite the ending. So she went to work like nothing had changed, served coffee and wiped down booths, nodded at regulars and practiced the kind of smile that showed just enough teeth to be believable, and when customers asked how she was doing, she lied so gently it sounded like truth. "I'm good, just tired." Like tired was her only defining trait, like her exhaustion had become a second name, but behind the counter, in that slow lull between 2 and 3 a.m. when the diner hummed low and sleepy, she kept touching that card in her pocket like it had heat, like it would burn through her skin if she didn't acknowledge it soon, and finally, one night, when the air felt thick and her chest felt too tight to ignore, she pulled out her cracked phone, opened a new text, and typed, "You left something behind," then hovered her thumb over the send button for a full minute before hitting it and immediately setting her phone face down like it might explode. She didn't expect a reply, not right away, maybe not ever, but 5 minutes later, the screen buzzed once, and when she flipped it over, his response was already there, only if you felt ready to find it, and somehow that made her chest tighten and loosen all at once. Like her breath didn't know which way to go, like her body was split between the woman who wanted to be careful and the girl who just wanted to be wanted without conditions. The next night, he came back, not at 10:15 like usual, but just after midnight, when the place was nearly empty and she was too tired to pretend she wasn't waiting, and when he stepped inside, the air shifted, not because of how he looked, he was still in that gray coat, still wore his tired eyes like a mask, but because he moved toward her like he wasn't sure if he was welcome, and that hesitation, that uncertainty, felt more honest than anything he could have said. She didn't speak, just nodded once and poured his tea, then walked over and set it down like muscle memory, but when she turned to leave, he gently touched her wrist, not hard, not possessive, just a light graze that stopped her like a whisper, and said, "I didn't want to make this complicated," and Riley, without looking at him, replied, "Then maybe you shouldn't have made it feel like it mattered," and there it was. Out in the open, the thing she'd been trying to outrun. Because the truth was, it did matter. Those notes weren't random, they weren't polite acts of kindness, they were pieces of connection, and now that she knew who he was, everything felt heavier, and he didn't deny it, didn't try to clean it up, just said softly, "It mattered to me too," and after a long silence, he added, "You reminded me that not all broken things are lost." And for a moment, the air between them stilled, thick with things neither of them had the right words for, so she said nothing, just stepped back and returned to the counter, heart hammering against her ribs, and when she looked up again, he was gone, but this time, no napkin, no note, just a quiet space and an unfinished cup of tea, and the ache of knowing that even real things sometimes don't last. But the next morning, she found something strange. A call from the diner owner asking if she'd be interested in taking over some assistant management duties, said. He'd heard good things, seen how she kept the place running even on off days, how she remembered the customers' orders before they sat down, and Riley almost laughed because none of that had changed in weeks, but something else clearly had, and she couldn't shake the thought that maybe Carter had something to do with it, maybe he'd said something behind the scenes, pulled strings she hadn't even known existed, and that terrified her. Not because she didn't want the opportunity, but because she didn't want to be given anything she hadn't earned, didn't want to be someone's charity case wrapped in compliments, and when she sat on the edge of her bed that night holding the management offer in one hand and the card in the other, she thought about how much easier it would be to stay small, to stay safe, to keep pretending she didn't care, but the truth was she did care, and not just about him, about herself, about being seen and taken seriously and having something that was hers, so she said yes to the promotion, and the next night she walked into work with her shoulders a little straighter, her smile a little realer, and when she looked at table 4 and saw him sitting there again, she didn't flinch, just walked over, poured his tea, and said, "You don't get to fix me, Carter," and he looked up slowly, eyes softer than she remembered, and said, "Good. Because I was hoping you didn't need fixing," and somehow, that line cracked something open inside her, not because it was perfect, but because it felt like the first honest thing she'd heard in weeks, and she sat down across from him, apron still on, hair pulled back, tired as hell, and said, "So what are we doing here?" And for once, she wasn't afraid to hear the answer. They didn't call it anything, not yet, not friendship, not interest, not a thing worth labeling, but the way Riley and Carter started sharing space at table 4 each night told a story louder than names ever could. He came in after the dinner rush, when the place had quieted to its usual hum, and she'd slide into the booth across from him when there were no more orders to run, and they'd talk, or sometimes not, because their silence had grown comfortable, like an old sweatshirt, worn, soft, fitting better the more it stretched, and Carter never pushed, never asked for her number, never even hinted at anything more than conversation, and that was what kept Riley coming back to the table, night after night, even when she was tired or irritated or emotionally raw, because he let her exist without performing, let her be more than polite. And one night he told her about his mother, how she worked late shifts her whole life to keep their apartment, how she used to leave little handwritten notes in his school lunch, always just one sentence, "Be kind, even when you're tired," and that was why he left napkins behind, because she taught him that small kindnesses leave big shadows. And Riley didn't say anything for a long time after that, just stared down at the chipped formica table and remembered her own mother's handwriting, not gentle like that, not warm, just rushed, loud, the kind of script that showed up in eviction notices and rehab admission forms, and once, when she was 12, on a sticky note taped to an empty fridge that just said, "Back in 2 days. Don't open the door for anyone," and how that note had stayed with her for years, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't, because of the silence in between. And Carter must have felt something shift in her because he didn't ask, didn't press, just said, "Some things are too heavy to put in a letter," and she nodded, finally, because he was right. Some things didn't need to be written down to leave scars. They just settled in your bones and waited to be named. And after that, their conversations turned softer, less guarded, like windows cracked open on warm nights, and she found herself telling him things she hadn't said out loud in years, about the miscarriage, about Dylan, about how she used to sleep in her car because at least it was hers. And Carter didn't react with pity or advice, just listened, really listened. And when she once asked him why he never tried to fix anything, why he didn't offer solutions like most men who couldn't sit with pain, he smiled a little and said, "Because I don't think healing's about solving, I think it's about being witnessed." And that line stuck with her, like a truth she'd always known but never found the words for. And slowly, she started letting herself enjoy his presence, not just tolerate it, even started saving the booth for him, refusing to seat others there even when it was busy, saying, "Sorry," reserved, with a straight face. And the staff started noticing, whispering behind the counter about the quiet man in the gray coat and the way Riley leaned in when she laughed, but she didn't care, because for the first time in years, something in her life felt uncomplicated, until it wasn't, because that's how life worked. It waited until your guard was just low enough to hurt you good, and it happened on a Friday, the first Friday she had ever invited Carter to stay after close. Said she had leftover pie and he could keep her company while she counted tips, and he'd smiled, real and warm, and sat at the counter while she talked about wanting to paint her apartment, wanting something yellow in her life again. And then her phone buzzed, an unknown number, and when she picked it up, a voice she hadn't heard in months said her name like an apology, "Riley, it's Mom." And just like that, the ground beneath her shifted again, because her mother only ever called when she needed something, when the rehab centers kicked her out, when the shelters ran out of space, when the boyfriends turned dangerous again. And this time was no different. She needed a place to stay, just for a few nights, just until she figured things out. And Riley wanted to say no, wanted to protect the fragile life she was building, the fragile self she was reclaiming, but guilt ran deep, deeper than pain, and so she said, "Okay, but just a few days." And when she hung up, she didn't realize tears were running down her cheeks until Carter gently slid a napkin toward her, the same kind he used to write on, only this time it was blank. And when she looked up at him, he said softly, "You don't have to explain." And that kindness undid her, not because it was new, but because she was so afraid of what it might cost her this time. She wanted to keep him safe, keep this piece safe, and her mother was a hurricane of old wounds, and so she wiped her face, forced a smile, and said, "Thanks," but didn't ask him to stay, didn't let him walk her home, just said goodnight like everything was fine. And when she got home, her mother was already waiting outside the door, looking thinner, older, like a version of her future if she wasn't careful, and Riley let her in, gave her clean sheets, made tea, and then sat awake most of the night staring at the ceiling wondering if she'd ever be allowed to just have something that didn't break. Her mother's presence filled the apartment like a fog, not loud, not violent, just heavy, the kind of weight that settles into corners and doesn't leave, and Riley moved through it with the familiar exhaustion of someone who'd been here before, tiptoeing around someone else's damage, folding back her own needs to make room for someone who'd never really made space for her, and in the first few days, it was manageable. Her mother slept a lot, didn't ask questions, mostly sat on the couch staring at old sitcom reruns like she could climb into them and escape, but then came the small things, the messes left behind, the late-night phone calls Riley pretended not to hear, the lies that fell too easily from her mother's lips, and most of all, the feeling that her apartment, her space, her peace, was slowly being chipped away, and yet she didn't say anything, not to her mother, not to Carter, especially not to Carter, because she didn't want to bring that version of her life into the one thing that still felt soft, and he didn't ask either, just kept coming to the diner, same time, same table, same cup of tea she never saw him drink, and she kept showing up too, more tired now, more distracted, but still there, and one night, when she collapsed onto the booth across from him and rubbed her temples, he simply said, "Want to not talk about it?" And she nodded, grateful, and for an hour they talked about anything else. Childhood cartoons, the worst jobs they'd ever worked, the best meals they'd ever eaten, and she found herself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in days, and afterward, as she walked home, the cold biting through her jacket and the sky heavy with stars, she thought about what it meant to have someone who gave you space without making you feel like you owed them something for it. But when she opened her apartment door and saw her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a half-empty bottle of something that definitely wasn't tea, her stomach dropped. "It's just one night," her mother slurred, "it's been a rough day," and Riley wanted to scream, wanted to ask if she even remembered why she was supposed to be sober, if she remembered the nights Riley spent driving around with nowhere to go while her mother lay passed out on the floor, but instead, she just cleaned up the mess, made her mother go to bed, and stood in the bathroom brushing her teeth with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. And that night she dreamt of table 4, dreamt that Carter reached across the table and handed her a note that just said, "Leave before it buries you," and she woke up crying into her pillow, the kind of crying that doesn't make sound, just leaks from you until you feel hollow, and when she got to work the next night, Carter was already there, but something in his face told her he knew, not the details, but the weight, and he didn't ask how she was, just said, "You didn't bring the pie last time," and it was such a small, stupid thing that she burst into laughter, real laughter, and brought him a slice with extra whipped cream, and for a moment, it felt normal again, like the storm wasn't knocking on her front door, but deep down she knew it couldn't last, and it didn't, because 2 nights later, she got a call at the diner. Her mother had wandered into the wrong apartment in their building and scared a neighbor's kid, and the landlord was threatening to call the police if Riley didn't handle it, so she left work early, heart pounding, and found her mother half asleep on the stairwell, muttering about missed chances and old names, and as she helped her up, Riley realized something sharp and final. She couldn't keep saving someone who wasn't even trying to swim, and that night, after putting her mother to bed again, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter, not long, not angry, just honest, explaining that she would pay for a week in a shelter, that she loved her, but she couldn't lose herself trying to hold pieces that refused to stay together, and she left the letter on the kitchen counter and went to work the next day with a knot in her stomach and an ache behind her eyes, and when Carter saw her, really saw her, he didn't smile, didn't joke, just said, "What do you need right now?" And she looked at him and whispered, "I need to feel like I exist outside of surviving," and he nodded once, stood up, and said, "Come on," and she followed him, out of the diner, down the street, to a quiet little bookstore she'd never noticed before, and they didn't speak, just browsed aisles, pointed out silly titles, sat in a back corner with tea that wasn't even good, and for an hour she forgot, just forgot, and when they left, he didn't try to hold her hand, didn't ask to come home with her, just said, "You deserve quiet that doesn't come with guilt," and that night, she walked into her apartment and found it empty, her mother gone, the letter taken, no mess left behind, and Riley sat on the couch and cried, not from fear or regret, but from the bittersweet freedom that always comes with choosing yourself, even when it hurts. The silence left behind when her mother disappeared was different this time. It didn't echo with panic or uncertainty, it settled like a blanket, still heavy, but clean, and for the first time in a long time, Riley wasn't holding her breath waiting for something to crash. She sat in that quiet for a long time, breathing it in like a new kind of air, unfamiliar but not unwelcome, and then she cleaned. Not because the apartment was dirty, but because she needed something to put her hands on. Something she could fix, unlike the years she'd spent trying to fix a woman who never wanted to be saved. And as she scrubbed the counters and rearranged the bookshelves and finally threw out the stack of unopened rehab brochures she'd stopped believing in years ago, she realized she was making space, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually, for the version of herself that had always been waiting beneath the tired one. And that night, when she walked into the diner, the world looked a little different, the lights a little warmer, the music less hollow. Even the cracked tiles behind the register felt like home instead of a trap, and when Carter came in, on time, as always, he looked at her like he felt the shift too, didn't say anything about it, just handed her a folded piece of paper, not a napkin this time but a proper envelope, and when she looked at him, brow raised, he said, "It's not a note. It's something else," and she didn't open it until after her shift, after the last customer left and the lights dimmed and the dishes were stacked and the world was still, and inside was a handwritten letter, not typed, not perfect, with ink smudges and crossed-out words, the kind that someone only writes when they mean every line, and it started simply, "Riley, I'm not sure what this is between us, and I'm not asking you to define it, but I need you to know you've changed something in me." Quietly, steadily, without trying, and that matters, and the rest of the letter unfolded with slow, careful honesty, about how he'd spent the last few years building buildings but never homes, filling his days with projects but never people, and how the first time he saw her at table 4, he recognized the same kind of tired in her that he had tried to hide in himself, and how writing the notes wasn't about rescuing her. It was about reminding himself that care doesn't have to be loud to be real, and when she finished reading it, she didn't cry, didn't smile, she just sat still for a long time, letting the weight of being seen settle into her bones, and the next day, she asked for the morning off and took the bus across town to the address he had scribbled on the envelope, an old brownstone with ivy on the windows and a mailbox leaning slightly to the left, and when she knocked, he opened the door like he'd been waiting for her without expecting her, and she said, "You were right, I needed to be seen," and he stepped aside without a word, letting her in, and they spent that day together not doing anything remarkable, just being, cooking a quiet breakfast, listening to old records, talking about nothing and everything, and when he asked her if she wanted to see something, she followed him up to the attic where stacks of his mother's boxes were still unopened, and together they went through them, old photos, recipe cards, the notes she used to leave, and it felt like opening up a memory that wasn't hers but one she understood, because grief is a language you don't have to speak out loud to recognize in someone else, and when he handed her a yellowed envelope labeled, "For someone who understands," they read it together, a letter from his mother, written years before she passed, full of quiet hope and forgiveness, and a line that said, "Be kind to the ones who carry invisible weight. They'll teach you how to love properly," and something about that line made Riley feel like maybe she was part of something bigger than herself, not fate, not destiny, just shared humanity stitched across strangers, and as the sun dipped low and the attic filled with gold light, Carter looked at her, really looked, and said, "I don't want to be a break in your peace," and she replied, "You're not, you're the one who waited while I found it," and they didn't kiss, didn't fall into each other like a movie ending. They just sat there with open boxes and open hearts, building something not out of spark, but out of steadiness, the kind that doesn't fizzle or flame out, the kind that stays, and when she left that evening, she felt full in a way she hadn't in years, not saved, not transformed, just whole, and the next night at the diner, she reserved table 4 with a note of her own, not written on a napkin but on thick paper, in the same careful penmanship he'd used, and when he opened it, he read, "I don't know where this goes, but I'm willing to find out if you are." And he looked at her across the room with that quiet smile of his and tapped once on the table, "Yes." They didn't rush into anything, not because they were afraid but because they both knew what happened when people mistook urgency for connection, when grief wore the mask of romance or loneliness dressed itself as love, so instead they chose something slower, gentler, the kind of steady presence that grew in quiet places, and over the next few weeks, their lives started to knit together in small, unspoken ways. Carter began showing up 10 minutes before Riley's shift ended just to help her wipe down the counters or refill the sugar caddies, and she stopped pretending she wasn't waiting for him, started keeping a second coffee cup behind the counter that she only brought out when he arrived, and the other staff noticed. Of course they did, but no one said much, maybe because they saw the softness between them, or maybe because Riley, who once walked like she carried an entire storm in her spine, had begun smiling without flinching. And that change was hard to ignore. It wasn't a dramatic kind of love, not the fireworks or public declarations or messy passion people wrote songs about. It was the kind that tucked a blanket over you without waking you up, the kind that left a note in your book when you forgot your page, and Riley found herself craving that stillness, that safety, in a way that surprised her, not because she didn't think she deserved it, but because she'd never allowed herself to believe it would stay. And Carter, for his part, never asked for more than she was ready to give. He didn't question when she flinched at certain words, didn't press when she didn't want to talk about her mother's absence. He just offered space, and when she was ready to fill it, he was there. And it was during one of those evenings, when the diner had emptied out and the jukebox had cycled through its last slow track, that he said, "You ever think about leaving this place?" And she looked up from her cleaning rag, brow raised. "The diner? This town," he clarified, "starting over somewhere that doesn't remember who you used to be." And she paused, really thought about it, because the truth was, she had, more times than she could count, especially on nights when the past pressed too close. But lately, that desire had softened, not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time, she wasn't alone in it. "I used to," she admitted, "but now I'm not sure I need to escape it to change it." And he nodded like he understood, and then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small box, not jewelry, not anything shiny, just a key, and he held it out to her. "To the brownstone," he said, "no pressure, just, if you ever need quiet, that's yours." And something about that gesture, offering a place without expectation, undid her, because no one had ever given her room without strings before, and she took it, not because she was ready to move in, but because she was ready to believe in the possibility. And that night, when she got home to her apartment, she sat on the floor and stared at the key in her palm, not crying, not panicking, just holding it like it was a small doorway to a future she might actually want. And over the next few days, she started spending mornings at the brownstone, not always with Carter, sometimes alone, just reading by the window or organizing the boxes he hadn't touched, turning the space into something that felt lived in. And during one of those mornings, she found a notebook tucked between old tax folders, a journal his mother kept during her last year, and she almost didn't read it, but there was a note on the first page in Carter's handwriting: "If you're here, it means I trust you. Thank you." And so she did, slowly, page by page, learning about a woman who wasn't perfect, who had her own shadows, her own regrets, but who loved deeply and without apology. And in those pages, Riley found reflections of her own fears, what it meant to be exhausted and still choose to give, to be afraid and still stay soft. And when she closed the journal, she felt closer to Carter in a way words couldn't replicate. And when he came home that evening and found her asleep on the couch, the journal still on her chest, he didn't say anything, just sat beside her and waited until her eyes opened. And when they did, she smiled without flinching. "She was a good writer," she said, and he replied, "She would have liked you." And that moment didn't need anything else, and so they didn't try to make it more than it was, just let it be enough. And it was. But peace doesn't always last, not without testing. And that test came 2 weeks later, when a tabloid article surfaced, blurry photo of Carter leaving the diner, headline reading, "Reclusive CEO's New Flame." And suddenly, the quiet they'd built was pierced by noise neither of them had invited. Reporters showed up at the brownstone, called the diner, even tried to follow Riley home, and she panicked, not because she was ashamed, but because she had never wanted a life that came with cameras. And Carter, when she confronted him, swore he hadn't said anything to anyone, hadn't known anyone was watching, and she believed him, she did, but it didn't change the way her hands trembled, the way she flinched when someone called her name on the street, because being known in that way, without control, was a fresh kind of wound. and for 2 days, she didn't go to the brownstone, didn't answer his messages, just tried to remember who she was before all of it, until she walked into the diner and found a small folded napkin on table 4, written in his familiar script, "I'll step back if you ask. But I'm not leaving unless you want me to," and something in her steadied then, because he wasn't fighting her pain, wasn't trying to convince her to be okay, he was just waiting, and so she called him that night, not with answers, but with honesty. They met at the bookstore, sat in the same back corner they always did, and she said, "I'm scared," and he said, "So am I," and that was enough, not because it fixed anything, but because now they were scared together, and being together made it a little less terrifying. Fear didn't vanish just because she named it, but sharing it with someone who didn't flinch made it easier to carry, and after that night in the bookstore, Riley and Carter began stitching their lives back into something softer, slower, even as the noise outside hadn't fully quieted. The tabloids eventually moved on, chasing newer drama, louder scandal, and the small wave of attention they'd endured settled back into silence. The kind Riley welcomed like an old friend, and during that silence, something changed, not between them, but within her, because where there had once been only survival, she now noticed room for choice, for gentleness, for the kind of comfort that doesn't demand but simply stays. She began spending more time at the brownstone, sometimes just to read, sometimes just to be, and Carter, always attuned, never asked when she'd make it official, never tried to press her into a timeline. He just made sure there was tea on the counter and a blanket on the couch, and on the days she didn't show, he left a fresh note in the journal she'd taken to using, not always about her, sometimes just a line from a book he was reading or a memory from his childhood, and the notes weren't grand or poetic, they were real, and that realness made her want to show up more often. And one Sunday afternoon, after restocking syrup at the diner, she looked around and realized she didn't feel tethered to it anymore. Not trapped, but not fulfilled either, and the next day, she gave her notice, not because she was running, but because she was ready to build something that belonged to her, and Carter offered, gently, to help her open something, a cafe, a bookstore, a studio, whatever she dreamed, and she didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either, and in the meantime, she poured her attention into creating peace in smaller ways, hosting open breakfast mornings at the brownstone for neighbors, organizing a second-hand book drive with the old bookstore downtown, and once, when a young woman from the diner who'd just escaped a bad situation showed up at her door crying, Riley let her in without question, gave her tea, gave her quiet, and gave her the guest room without asking anything back, and Carter just nodded like he understood, because he did, because when someone's built their life from fractured pieces, they know how to make space for others still finding theirs. And one night, long after that girl had found her own place and left a note behind thanking Riley for being her soft place to land, Carter sat beside Riley in the garden, legs tangled, her head resting on his chest, and said, "You know you're building something, right?" And she smiled into his shirt, "What, a bed and breakfast for broken people?" And he laughed, not at her, but with her, because even now, even after all the healing, the jokes were still a little jagged, and she added, "Maybe that's what I've always wanted to be. A place someone can rest," and he kissed the top of her head and whispered, "You already are," and they sat there in silence, listening to the wind and the city and the heartbeat between them that had grown steady over time, not loud, not desperate, just certain. And when she finally spoke again, it was a question she hadn't asked before, not because she didn't want the answer, but because she hadn't been ready to hear it. "Did you fall in love with me before you ever spoke to me?" And Carter was quiet for a while, then said, "No, but I think I recognized you before I knew your name," and that made her cry, not hard, not messy, just tears that came from a place too deep to reach any other way. And that night she moved her things into the brownstone, not all at once, not with fanfare, but piece by piece, her favorite coffee mug, her record player, a photo of her from childhood where her eyes were still soft, and with every item, she carved out space in that house for herself, for her past, for her future. And when she finally brought over the envelope full of his old napkin notes, she placed them in a glass box on the mantel, not as a shrine, but as a beginning. And when Carter saw it, he touched the glass like it might still be warm and whispered, "She found her way home," and Riley whispered back, "So did he," and neither of them needed to say more, because this wasn't about saving or being saved. It was about what happens when two people stop hiding from their own softness and finally let someone stay. They didn't mark the day with anything grand, no champagne or photos or declarations, but Riley remembered it all the same. The first morning she woke up in the brownstone and didn't feel like she was visiting, the way the light spilled across the floor in soft gold streaks, the sound of Carter's quiet footsteps in the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and coffee and something steady in the air, and she sat up slowly, listening, realizing with a stillness that felt sacred that she wasn't waiting for something to fall apart. For the first time in years her body wasn't bracing for loss, and when she walked downstairs, barefoot and sleepy-eyed, and saw him standing there in sweatpants, holding a mug in one hand and the paper in the other, she smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was peaceful, and peace had always felt like the most impossible luxury, and Carter looked up and smiled too, the kind that didn't need words, and handed her a cup without asking how she liked it. Because he already knew, and they stood there in silence, sipping and soft, and it felt like more of a commitment than any ring ever could. Later that week, she started painting the spare room, not for any particular reason, just because she wanted to put color on the walls, something warm, something alive, and he helped, even though he was terrible at edging and got paint on the floor twice, and when she asked why he was still smiling, he said, "Because I spent too many years alone in rooms." That never changed, and she didn't respond, just kissed the tip of his nose and kept painting, and over time, the house began to look less like a museum of grief and more like a living, breathing place. Plants she forgot to water but tried anyway, books stacked in corners, notes on the fridge, shoes by the door, and sometimes, in the quiet of evening, she'd catch Carter staring at her like she was something he never thought he'd have and still couldn't believe he did, and she let him look. Because she understood that awe, felt it every time he handed her a note folded in half like a secret, like he still wanted to remind her that she mattered even now, especially now, and yet, for all the growth, for all the softness they had built, Riley still had days when the past felt too close, when a smell or a sound or an unexpected envelope would knock the air out of her, and Carter never tried to fix those days, just offered her space and arms and time, and she did the same for him, like when he finally broke down in the attic one afternoon, surrounded by boxes he hadn't touched since the funeral, and she held him while he wept for a mother he missed in ways too tangled to say out loud, and afterward, he said, "I keep thinking about what she'd say if she saw me now," and Riley said, "She'd say you're braver than you believe," and they didn't speak after that, just sat there in the quiet, the kind that feels holy when it's shared, and life continued in this rhythm, work, rest, growth, tenderness. And then one evening, out of nowhere, Carter handed her a napkin again, and she laughed because it had been months since he'd written one, and when she unfolded it, her hands trembling with something between nostalgia and wonder, it read, "If I asked you to build a life with me, would you need more time?" And she looked at him, his eyes wide with vulnerability, and whispered, "No," and he smiled, not big, just enough, and then kissed her like she was already home, and though there was no ring, no official question, no planned proposal, they both knew something had shifted, that this was no longer a maybe but a yes, and in the days that followed, they talked about what that meant, not in timelines or traditions, but in little things, like joint grocery lists and shared calendars, like how many chairs the kitchen table should have if they started hosting Sunday dinners, like whether they'd repaint the living room or leave the scuffs because they told a better story, and they didn't announce anything to the world, didn't post about it, just let the people close to them see the way their love had deepened, matured, settled into something rooted, and then, weeks later, during a rainy evening while sorting through a donation box from the bookstore drive, they found a notebook, old and leather-bound, with a name scribbled in the back, J.L., age 16, and inside were poems, raw and aching, and Riley held it to her chest because she recognized the handwriting. It belonged to her, it had been hers before life hardened her edges, and she had donated it years ago by accident, thinking it lost forever, and Carter looked at her while she cried over words she'd written as a girl who still believed in magic, and he said, "Even then, you were building a world you hadn't lived in yet." And she kissed him through the tears, not because it made her feel weak, but because it made her feel whole, and that night, she framed one of the poems and hung it above their bed, a line that simply read, "I am still becoming, and that is enough," and Carter whispered, "It always will be." The framed poem above their bed became a quiet compass, a reminder that growth wasn't about arrival but motion, and in the mornings when sunlight crept in soft and golden across the hardwood floor, Riley would open her eyes, stretch slowly, and feel something unfamiliar but welcome settle in her chest, a calm that didn't ask her to prove anything, just to exist. And Carter, always up before her, would be in the kitchen humming low to some half-remembered tune, barefoot, hair still messy from sleep, and she'd stand in the doorway and watch him like the world finally made sense, not because it was perfect but because it was hers, and theirs, and real, and days turned into weeks like that, not with fireworks or milestones but with steady glances and shared grocery lists, with cups of tea and notes on mirrors that read "You've done enough today," and sometimes, after a hard shift at the bookstore where she now managed donations and led poetry circles on Sundays, she'd come home to a bath already drawn or a new novel laid open with a line underlined that said, "This reminded me of you," and it wasn't just sweet, it was knowing, a kind of love that studied you gently without trying to change you. And as fall began to color the leaves outside the brownstone, as the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke lingered in the halls, they started thinking about what came next, not in the way that demanded action, but in the way that imagined more. And one morning, while sitting across from each other with mismatched mugs in hand and music low in the background, Carter asked, "What would you call it?" And she blinked. "Call what?" And he said, "The place you want to build, if it were yours, all yours." And the question surprised her, not because she hadn't thought about it but because she hadn't allowed herself to believe it could happen, and she looked at him, steady and sure, and said, "Maybe, something like Quiet House," and he smiled, soft and proud, and replied, "Then let's build Quiet House." And over the next several months, they began to shape it, slowly, thoughtfully, turning the lower level of the brownstone into a space for anyone who needed pause, not a business, not a clinic, just a place where people could sit, breathe, read, cry, eat warm bread, speak poetry aloud or not at all. And Riley poured her whole self into it, bringing in shelves of second-hand books and hand-stitched blankets from women's shelters, brewing chai from her grandmother's old recipe, putting poems on napkins again, this time for strangers who didn't even know her name. And Carter, ever steady, handled the permits and the paint and the plumbing, showing up with rolled sleeves and dusty hands and the kind of quiet joy that only comes from building something that matters. And when they opened Quiet House, there were no speeches, no cameras, just a small sign by the door that read, "If you're tired, you belong here." And the first person to walk in was a girl no older than 20. Shoulders hunched like she was carrying years, and when Riley handed her a cup of tea and asked her name, the girl whispered, "Does it matter?" And Riley smiled and replied, "Only if you want it to." And the girl cried, not loudly, just one long, trembling breath, and sat down in the corner by the window like she'd found something she didn't know she'd been looking for. And that became the rhythm. Some came to talk, some came to sleep, some came just to sit in the presence of a kindness they didn't have to earn. And every time Riley walked through those doors, she felt her younger self rising inside her, not the broken one, but the girl who had once believed in magic and words and connection and healing, and now she was giving that girl a home. And Carter never stopped supporting it, never tried to claim credit or stand in the light, just watched from the doorway, always ready with repairs and late-night tea and handwritten grocery lists for the pantry that always seemed to empty faster than they stocked it. And every now and then, he'd leave a note for Riley in the old napkin box by the register, still folded the way he used to, and she'd find them between shifts, messages like "You're the quiet after the storm" or "This place carries your heartbeat." And she never told anyone how much those notes still made her knees a little weak, still made her believe in love like it was a steady, ordinary miracle. And when winter came, they hosted a small gathering for all the people who had passed through Quiet House, poetry on the walls, candles lit in mason jars, homemade soup on the stove. And someone asked Riley what the place meant to her, and she paused, then said, "It means I'm not afraid of softness anymore." And afterward, when the crowd had thinned and the room had dimmed and the wind tapped gently at the windows, Carter pulled her into his arms and whispered, "I'm proud of you." And she leaned into his chest and whispered back, "I'm proud of us, because none of it, none of the healing, none of the hope, none of the quiet blooming in the cracks, could have happened if he hadn't seen her that first night, just a folded napkin and a silent booth and a woman trying her best not to break. And now here they were, not fixed, not perfect, but whole in the ways that mattered, still choosing each other every morning, still growing something soft from all that had once been sharp. Sometimes healing didn't look like light pouring through windows or laughter echoing off clean floors. Sometimes it looked like Riley waking up in the middle of the night from dreams she couldn't explain, heart pounding with memories she thought she'd buried, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands shaking, not from fear but from the quiet realization that even peace had shadows, and Carter would wake without speaking, walk over, sit behind her, wrap his arms around her waist, and just breathe with her until the tremor passed, not asking questions, not offering advice, just anchoring her in the now, reminding her that she was no longer the girl waiting for love to arrive in fragments, that she was no longer holding the weight alone, and it was in those moments, the ones without poetry or perfection, that she realized how far they'd come, because the version of her that once ran from softness now lived inside of it, now helped others into it, and Quiet House continued to grow. Not louder, not bigger, but deeper, with faces that returned week after week, people who brought baked bread and secondhand sweaters and poems written on torn receipts, people who didn't speak for the first 3 visits but finally did on the 4th, and Riley learned how to sit with people the same way Carter once sat with her, learned how to listen without filling the space, how to hold someone without touching them, and it changed her. Not all at once, but in the small, quiet ways that last longer than thunder ever could. And then one afternoon, a woman showed up at Quiet House, thin, pale, clutching a rolled-up flannel like a shield, and when Riley stepped forward to greet her, the woman looked up and said her name, and Riley's entire body stilled, because it was her mother, older now, more fragile, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know where else to go, and Riley didn't speak, not for a long breath, because the girl inside her screamed and the woman she'd become stayed calm, and somehow, both versions of her existed at once in that hallway, and finally, she stepped back and said, "Come in, if you're staying sober," and her mother nodded, eyes wide with something like shame or fear or maybe hope, and Riley led her to the back, poured tea, didn't ask questions, just let her sit there in the stillness, and for days after, she said nothing to Carter about it, not because she didn't trust him, but because she needed to carry this one in her own time, and he understood. Of course he did. Just watched her more closely, left extra notes around the house like breadcrumbs back to comfort. You're allowed to draw your boundaries in pen, and blood doesn't define safety, and you're still allowed to be proud of how far you've come, and it helped, those reminders, more than he probably realized, and eventually she told him, one night after the dinner rush, sitting on the kitchen floor with takeout containers between them, and he didn't react with judgment or anger or worry, just said, "Is she part of your healing, or a test of it?" And Riley didn't answer right away because the truth was, she didn't know if her mother would stay, if she would relapse, if she would disappear again, but she did know that this time, Riley wouldn't break with her, wouldn't lose herself trying to save someone else's sinking boat, and that was growth, not the kind you frame, but the kind you feel in your spine when you say no and mean it, when you say yes and know it's yours to give. And when her mother asked one morning if she could help fold the laundry at Quiet House, Riley handed her a basket without a word, not forgiveness, not trust, just a start, and that was enough. And when Riley looked in the mirror that night brushing her teeth, she barely recognized the woman staring back, not because she'd changed into someone new, but because she'd finally returned to herself. And Carter kissed her shoulder, whispered, "You're doing so well," and she smiled with a kind of softness that once felt impossible, because healing, she realized, wasn't a destination, it was a room you keep walking into, again and again, even when you're scared, especially when you're scared, and she was proud of herself, not for being strong, but for staying gentle through it all, for building a life where tired girls could rest and broken women could be whole, and where she, Riley, just Riley, was enough, without proving, without performing, without asking for permission. The days that followed moved gently, like pages turning in a well-worn book, unrushed, full of quiet meaning, and Riley found herself paying closer attention to the spaces between moments, the way sunlight stretched across the hardwood each morning like a promise that didn't need to be spoken, the way her hands moved on autopilot when making tea for someone who still hadn't learned how to ask for comfort, the way Carter's eyes softened every time he looked at her like he still couldn't believe. She stayed, And there was something holy in that steadiness, in building a life not from perfect pieces but from persistence, from two people who chose to stay even on the days when staying was hard, and her mother, to Riley's cautious surprise, did stay, for a while, at least. Not every day was clean, not every breath easy, but she folded laundry, swept the entry, even started greeting visitors at Quiet House with the same voice Riley remembered from childhood, soft but a little too rehearsed. Like she was trying to prove she belonged there, and Riley didn't rush to trust her, didn't let her too close, but she watched, she listened, and she allowed herself to acknowledge that this version of her mother, fragile, sober, trying, was still better than none. And some nights, when the house was quiet and the teacups rinsed and the lights dimmed low, she'd sit with Carter and talk about all the versions of herself she had survived to become this one, the one who now had people depending on her and didn't feel crushed by it, who could look in the mirror without shame and whisper, "You are here," and believe it. And Carter, always steady, always listening, would reach for her hand and remind her, "This is what you built, Riley, not for anyone else, but for you." And she'd squeeze his fingers like she believed it too, and in the stillness of that life, something new began to stir, not loudly, not like a drumbeat or a thunderclap, but like a faint flutter in her chest that she almost mistook for nerves, until one morning, when the sun was barely up and the smell of coffee hadn't yet reached the room, she sat on the edge of the tub holding a pregnancy test in her shaking hand, staring down at two unmistakable pink lines, and the silence that followed wasn't fear or grief or panic, it was awe, deep and breathless, and for a moment, she just sat there, knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide, letting the weight of it sink into her skin, and her first thought, oddly enough, wasn't about names or nursery colors or even how to tell Carter. It was about whether this new life inside her would ever feel what she once felt, small, discarded, tired before they were even old enough to understand what tired meant, and immediately she whispered, "Not if I can help it." And later that day, when Carter came home and found her sitting at the kitchen table with that same look she had the night she told him about her mother, he didn't speak right away, just pulled up a chair and waited. And when she placed the test in front of him, he looked at it for a long time, then back at her, and asked, "How do you feel?" And she blinked, surprised by the question, then said, "Like I might finally be ready to give someone the life I never had." And he nodded, no panic, no hesitation, just took her hand and said, "Then we'll build that life together." And they sat like that for a while, no need for anything else, no elaborate celebrations, just two people quietly deciding that love, once again, would not be a spectacle, it would be a shelter. And over the following weeks, Riley continued to run Quiet House, slower now, more mindful of her body, of her rest, and the regulars noticed, of course they did, asked softly, smiled knowingly, brought her herbal teas and knitted blankets and small gifts wrapped in kindness, and her mother, to Riley's absolute disbelief, started cooking again, nothing fancy, just soft meals that smelled like memory, like home. And one evening, when Riley sat with her on the back porch and watched the leaves turn gold, her mother said, "I know I missed your beginning, but maybe I can show up for someone else's." And for the first time in her adult life, Riley didn't hold her breath waiting for disappointment, she just nodded, not forgiveness, not erasure, but acceptance. And as her belly grew and the world outside shifted from fall to winter, Riley let herself imagine a future she'd once never dared to dream, laughter in the hallways, little footsteps on the stairs, books stacked beside sippy cups, love layered on top of love, and Carter, always beside her, already reading parenting books and drawing cribs on diner napkins, still writing her notes on the bathroom mirror like she didn't already know how he felt. And one morning, as the snow fell quiet against the windows and she stood in the living room staring at the framed poem above their bed, she whispered, "We're still becoming," and Carter walked in behind her, wrapped his arms around her belly, and replied, "And it's still enough." Winter deepened slowly, like the world was holding its breath for what came next, and in that soft stillness, Riley found herself nesting, not in the Pinterest perfect way people posted about but in quiet, instinctive movements, like folding towels with care, organizing the Quiet House pantry more often than necessary, and sorting baby clothes in the middle of the night just to calm her racing thoughts. And sometimes she'd wake up with Carter's hand on her belly, his breathing steady, his fingers unconsciously tracing circles over the new life growing between them, and she'd smile in the dark, thinking about all the versions of love she had met in this life, messy, conditional, transactional, but this one was different, not perfect, but rooted, like a tree learning to hold through every storm, and the storm did come, not in the way she feared, not in a dramatic explosion of everything falling apart, but in a phone call one gray afternoon, her mother's voice shaking as she whispered, "He's here, your father," and Riley felt every part of her stillness break, not because she hadn't expected this moment, but because some wounds reopen even when you think you've outgrown them, and she didn't say anything right away, just stood there in the middle of the cafe kitchen holding her phone like it was something burning, until Carter walked in, saw her face, and immediately said, "What happened?" And when she finally choked out the words, "He found us," Carter's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Then we deal with it," and the steadiness in him calmed her too, reminded her she wasn't the girl who used to run, she was the woman who had stayed, who had rebuilt, who had survived everything meant to break her, and now, she would protect what she built, no matter what. And when she finally agreed to meet her father, it wasn't out of guilt or curiosity, it was closure. And when she stepped into the cafe that day and saw him, older, thinner, eyes filled with something that wasn't quite regret but maybe exhaustion, maybe recognition, she didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't collapse, she just sat down and said, "You don't get to rewrite history," and he nodded like he knew that already, told her he had cancer, that he wasn't there to ask for anything, just wanted to know she'd made it, and she told him she had, not because of him, but despite him. And when he reached for her hand across the table, she didn't take it, but she didn't pull away either. And when she left, there were no promises, no soft music swelling in the background, just a woman walking out into the cold, lifting her face to the wind, breathing in the weight of something finally finished. And that night, when Carter held her tighter than usual and whispered, "You don't owe anyone your peace," she nodded into his chest and let the tears come, because sometimes healing doesn't feel like triumph, it feels like grief. And that was okay too, and the next morning, the world looked the same, but she didn't, and she noticed it in the way she smiled at customers again, in how she didn't rush when her mother said something triggering, in how she touched her belly with reverence instead of fear, and as the baby's kicks grew stronger and her due date inched closer, Riley felt like her life was stretching open, not just for this child, but for the woman she was still becoming. And in those final weeks of waiting, Carter built the crib himself, sanding each piece late into the night while Riley read out loud from books they both laughed at, and every time she caught him staring at her like she was some kind of miracle, she'd say, "I'm still me, you know," and he'd reply, "That's exactly why I stare." And on the night their baby finally came into the world, a girl, born just before sunrise with lungs full of protest and eyes already searching, Riley cried harder than she ever had, not because she was afraid, but because it felt like every version of herself had arrived in that room to bear witness, from the girl who had once been left on a porch with a suitcase to the woman now holding her daughter in her arms. And when she looked at Carter, wide-eyed and teary, she said, "She gets to start clean," and he kissed her forehead and whispered, "Because her mother fought like hell to make that possible." In the weeks after their daughter's birth, time bent in strange, beautiful ways, nights blurred into days, silence danced with tiny cries, and everything Riley once thought was essential suddenly faded under the weight of that tiny heartbeat nestled against her chest. And yet in the quiet between feedings, in the moments where sunlight filtered through the quiet house windows and bathed the floor in gold, she realized she hadn't disappeared inside motherhood like she once feared, she had expanded. Become more, not less. And watching Carter cradle their daughter, his business calls on pause, luxury deals stacked unread on his desk while he hummed lullabies he didn't even realize he knew, made her heart ache in the gentlest way because she could feel it, the shift, not just in them, but around them, the world recalibrating, their relationship deepening into something that wasn't loud or fiery, but rooted, a quiet understanding that no boardroom or gala could ever match. And still, as peace settled in their home, echoes of the past kept brushing against the edges, like the anonymous letter that arrived one morning, no return address, just a photo inside, grainy but unmistakable, her mother, years younger, beside a man Riley had never seen before but now realized was not her father, not the man who'd abandoned them, but someone else entirely. And beneath the photo, scrawled in rushed, unsteady ink, "Ask her about Madrid," and suddenly, the ground shifted again, not violently, but With the slow, seismic promise that her story wasn't finished yet, that her past still held keys to rooms she hadn't dared open, and when she confronted her mother, the truth came in broken pieces. Madrid was where Riley had been conceived, not as part of a love story, but a transaction, a temporary entanglement between her mother and a powerful Spanish businessman whose name had been buried for decades in silence and shame. And that man, her biological father, wasn't a ghost after all. He was alive, wealthy, and apparently looking for her, and for a moment, Riley wanted to reject it, to shut the door and live inside the peace she'd finally built, but something in her daughter's cry reminded her. Truth was not the enemy, silence was, and so with Carter's hand in hers and a fire in her chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with legacy, she made the call, booked the flight, and days later, found herself in Madrid, standing before the gates of a villa that looked like it belonged in a magazine: marble fountains, manicured gardens, sunlight-warming sandstone walls. And when a man opened the door with eyes that mirrored hers, older but familiar, neither of them spoke for a long moment, as if DNA had its own language, and finally he said, "I thought I'd lost the only good thing I ever did," and Riley replied, "Then maybe it's time we stop losing." And the hours that followed didn't erase history, but they rewrote something in both of them, and when she returned home to the States with a signed letter acknowledging her as his legal heir, it wasn't the wealth that mattered, though yes, the accounts were large, the stakes high, the properties international. It was the fact that for once, she wasn't someone's mistake or shame or secret, she was someone's daughter by choice, by name, and she promised herself she would give her own child a story like that too, one built on clarity, courage, and truth, no matter how messy it looked from the outside. And as she walked back through the quiet house door, holding her baby close and Carter waiting with that unshakable calm he wore like armor, she whispered, "She'll know where she comes from, and how far we've come to give her this." The night they decided to celebrate was unplanned, as most perfect things are, just a quiet dinner on the rooftop of their quiet house, where fairy lights tangled with the stars and the city hummed softly below, and Carter had cooked, clumsily but with so much love that Riley couldn't stop laughing when he burned the risotto and tried to salvage it with truffle oil, and their daughter, now toddling on unsteady feet, clutched her silver spoon like it was a trophy, babbling to the moon like she had secrets to tell. And as Riley leaned into Carter's chest, his heartbeat steady against her ear, she realized she had rewritten every page of her story, not erased the old chapters, but layered new ones over them, rich with meaning, stitched with tears and triumph, and somewhere between the bitter and the sweet, she had become the woman she once thought only existed in dreams or novels or someone else's skin. Only this version wore no mask, no borrowed surname, no performance, just Riley Hart. Daughter, mother, wife, heiress, survivor, and dreamer. And the next day, as she walked through the new foundation headquarters, her foundation, not Carter's or her father's but hers, where young women like she once was would get a second chance, a room, a mentor, a future, she smiled at the name on the wall, the Heart Initiative, because she'd built it with her whole heart, every shattered and healed piece of it. And when she stepped on stage at her first public gala, wearing a silk dress chosen not for its price tag but for how it made her feel, alive, elegant, like her story mattered, she opened her speech with no rehearsed lines, just truth. "I was once the girl nobody saw. Then the world tried to define me. But I chose who I became. And now, I'm here to tell every woman in this room, you are not what you've lost. You are who you rise to be." The applause was thunderous, but it was the look in Carter's eyes that undid her. Quiet pride, reverence, love that had endured every storm. And later that night, as they slow danced in their bedroom, no music playing, just breath and memory, he whispered, "You changed the ending," and she smiled, kissing his shoulder, whispering back, "No, love. I just finally got to write it myself." And as the moon spilled across their room and their daughter's laughter echoed from the hallway like a promise, Riley knew the truth that would outlast even legacy. Not all fairy tales are born in castles, some are carved from courage, stitched in silence, and rewritten by women who refuse to be forgotten.